Now, how could a man appointed to the Supreme Court by President George W. Bush side with the Obama administration on this controversial law? Even the so-called swing vote on the bench, Justice Anthony Kennedy not only voted to strike down the law, but according to an AP reporter inside of the courtroom, Kennedy appeared visibly angry when the opinion was read. And here to explain the driving force, or what was likely the driving force behind Roberts' decision, our friend, Fox News contributor Charles Krauthammer. Charles, welcome back, sir.
Happy to be with you, Sean.
And you wrote a column, Why Roberts Did It. Why did he do it?
Well, I think it's clear that he sees himself as committed to two things. Number one, he's a conservative in philosophy, and he was dead set against ruling Obamacare constitutional on the grounds that it is under the Commerce Clause. Because he argued, as did the other conservative justices, that once you do that, and you interpret it as not just regulating commerce, but it is actually creating or compelling Congress, you've expanded it to the point where there's no limit on what Congress can do, and we've changed our system of government. So he was all along not going to claim it could be done under the Commerce Clause. He wants to see it restrained. But there's something different about him. He sees himself as Chief Justice of the United States as having a second role as custodian of the reputation and the stature and the standing of the court. And I think that the reason he went searching for some other way to uphold Obamacare is that he was afraid if Obamacare were struck down by the 5-4 conservative majority, that it would weaken the prestige, the standing of the court. Now, he has some basis for that. The way the court ruled in the 70s high-handedly on abortion to wipe out all the abortion laws in the land created a 40-year reaction of people who think that was extra-constitutional and incredibly arrogant. And there is still the fallout of a more recent decision, the Bush v. Gore, in which the case was decided by a narrow majority, a 5-4 majority, along ideological lines. And I think he thought that if that happened with Obamacare, it would be called, and you know the Democrats and the liberals and the mainstream media were gearing up to assail him and the court as making partisan decisions instead of constitutional ones. And that, I think, is the reason he set out to find some other way to justify the mandate, and he did. It was a flimsy argument. I think it's a dodge. The idea that a mandate is a tax, it doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. But that was, if you ask me why he did it, and I'm not speaking as a psychiatrist, but just as an analyst of the court, I would say that is the reason.
But, you know, Charles, I read your piece in its entirety, and you did quote the and talk about his comments that if you don't like the politics, basically you can make changes. And that, I thought, was the most interesting thing that he wrote in the entire piece. But what you're really saying here, though, is that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was swayed more by politics than he was by the Constitution. And that's troubling to me because, you know...
Well, it troubles me as well. I was simply laying out what I think is behind his decision. I don't think there's any other way to explain it. And I think you're right. Politics in the sense that he thought there would be a firestorm of protest against the court and it would suffer. And I think he feels, as the Chief Justice, that he has a unique responsibility. I'm not saying he's right on this, but I think he feels he has a unique responsibility to maintain its stature and the appearance of being neutral. And I think that's why he did it. But I would add one thing. There is something conservative about the notion that a court should always be loath to overturn any law duly passed by the House and the Senate and the President, and particularly a law that is so sweeping, was debated for 18 months. And I think that, in part, it's a conservative position. Now, I would have said, yes, that's a reason that you want to uphold the law. However, the only way that you can defend the mandate is by invoking the Commerce Clause. And if you do, you have destroyed the idea of America as a government of enumerated powers. and thus I would have overturned it.
Yeah.
But I'm just trying to explain what I think ran through his mind.
You know, but I actually agree with the dissent of Scalia, Kennedy, Alito, and Justice Thomas here. Yeah. And on the Commerce Clause, they said you cannot regulate commerce that does not exist, but they were far more scathing in their remarks that, frankly, you can only interpret as being aimed at the Chief Justice, that the tax argument is bunk. The court cannot rewrite Obamacare to make the tax argument work. They referred to it as feeble being the tax argument. They said there's a mountain of evidence against the tax argument. The tax argument makes no sense. I mean, these are his fellow justices saying that.
I agree entirely with the dissent on that. It is very clear that Roberts was just straining to find something, and in fact he picked the third line of defense for Obamacare by the proponents of the bill, one that was so weak that they themselves devoted only 21 lines in the brief. And it came up almost never. I mean, it hardly occupied any of the oral debate. Everybody knows that was the weakest of the three defenses, and that's why I think everybody is so astonished. A tax is something that you do to raise revenue. A penalty is something that you do to deter conduct.
Yeah.
When you run a red light, you get a notice. It doesn't say you are now assessed a speeding tax. You're assessed a speeding penalty. And the reason that I think the dissent was so scathing on this attempt to equate a tax with a penalty in the mandate is that in this case the penalty was what he's calling a tax was obviously punitive, regulatory, and intended to compel behavior. That's not a tax. That's a penalty. That's a fine. That's a mandate.
And the president's insisting, and the White House is insisting still today, that it is not a tax, but yet, and the president promised it wouldn't be a tax, but the Solicitor General, in fact, argued it was a tax.
Which is what makes it all the more hollow and I think illogical.
Quite illogical. Charles, appreciate you being with us. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.